I'm currently finishing up a beat and I wanted to record the mastering process. So I think I have it the way that I want it, arrangement wise and all that stuff. So now I'm going to, at this point, what you would do is isolate the loudest part of the beat, but the problem, anyway. So I have my melodies, okay? I have my 808 right here, okay? And then I have all my drum sounds. So my kicks, my snares, my hats, all that stuff over here. Okay, and then I have all that going to one place, this pre-master chain right here. Okay, so let's run through the pre-master chain. And another thing is this video is meant to be twofold. I'm somewhat of a mastering novice myself. I've just kind of learned over time through trial and error and watching videos online. So if you don't know anything about mixing and mastering, hopefully you learned something. And on the flip side, if you're an expert in the field and you know what you're doing, and you see something that I can improve, feel free to throw that in the comments. So, like I said, it's twofold. Either hopefully you learned something from watching this, or hopefully I learned something in the process. The very first thing I have on here, and one thing I've noticed over time, and I'll probably make adjustments to this as I go, is I have a lot of different EQs, and some of them are probably redundant. I probably don't need as many of these because I'm kind of using them all more or less in the same way, just to cut lows and cut highs. But for now, let's leave it alone. Okay, and then in my mastering chain, I've got a whole bunch of different processes. So Maximus, okay, and you'll see I have 3 different instances of Maximus. And then once I do my master chain, I've got one more instance, but in this one, I've only got 3. And the idea is in each instance of Maximus, I'm going to be moving the bands in so that they're less and less extreme and more normalized. And I'm going to be doing small amounts of compression in each band as I go. And so the idea is if you can shave off a little bit of sound here, a little bit of sound there, a little bit of sound over there. If you do that enough times in enough, frequency ranges, hopefully you'll be able to kind of push the volume of everything else up and make the entire track louder. So at least that's the idea. So let's look at our first instance of Maximus. What we'll notice for the bands of Maximus, they're kind of extremes. So the lows are 50 hertz and below, the highs are 10K and above. And then again, as I do more instances of Maximus, I'm going to be moving these bands inwards so that they're a little bit less extreme. So this is 50 hertz and below. I'm going to hit play. Okay, and what I'm looking for here is I want to make sure that my low end gets loud enough relative to most other things. So my starting point is usually I bring this down here to where this -9 is. It's not exactly -9, it's -8.7. And I want to make sure that my low end is getting at least to this point. And in this case, I am. It looks like I'm going a bit above that. So I'm actually going to do a little bit of compression to kind of bring the rest of this up to where these are getting. So I'm going to push into this compressor just a little bit. Okay, and now I'm going to level match. Okay, so I pushed up into this 1.7 dBs. So I need to pull this back by 1.7. Okay. And that's the low band. And sometimes another thing I'll do, in fact, I might do it here, is I'll put a thing down here so that the quietest stuff, and then I'll kind of arc this down a little bit. That way, anything that's really, really quiet kind of gets ducked down in volume. Because oftentimes, stuff that's really quiet in this super low range is just kind of residual sound left over from other instruments that didn't get EQ'd out properly. And that stuff is only going to make things muddy, typically. So I like to kind of do a little bit of a gentle, hey, if you're too quiet, you're not going to be heard quite as much type of deal down here. And then I'll do the opposite for anything that's above this red line, all the way up to the loudest stuff. I like to kind of push the volume just a little bit, make it a little bit punchier, and then make this boom part of the 808, the rumble that comes after the initial impact, make that a little bit louder as well. That's what this does. Okay, let's go to the mid band. Now the mid band, as you can see, is basically the entire beat. So you'll notice on this first instance of Maximus, I'm doing compression with this little dot up here by the 9. Okay, it's up here close to this 9. And what that means is I'm doing small amounts of compression. Okay, in the next instance of Maximus, I will take this band and I will bring it down to the 6, or roughly there. And then in the third one, I'll bring it down to the 3. And then in the last instance of Maximus, I'll bring it all the way down so that it's flat. What that means is at that point, I'll be doing limiting instead of compression. So let's continue. So I'm already getting, visually, I could see I'm getting way too loud with this. So I am going to be doing a pretty decent amount of compression here. So because of that, I don't want to be compressing the majority of this stuff. I really only want to worry about this really loud stuff. So let's hit play. Obviously this is too much, so I'm going to pull this back. Okay. So I pushed up into this 1.5, and this may be a little bit too much compression. I may come back and reduce this, I'm not sure. But 1.5, so I'm going to pull this down by 1.5. Let's go to the highs. So the highs are just 10K and above. So I'm okay with compressing the highs a little bit more. And the reason for that is normally because my clap or my snare tends to bleed into the high range a little bit more. And I don't necessarily want the clap or the snare to be the most like prominent thing in this high end. So let's see what it looks like. It sounds like. And as we can see up here, I'm really only reducing the volume when that little rim or snare hits, and then occasionally at other times, but it's a very small amount. And that's what I want. I want to make sure that my hats are the most like prominent thing in this higher register. Okay, so I pushed this up by 11.1, so let's pull this back by 11.1. And then a similar thing is happening with the master as was happening with the mid-range, because there's just so much information in here. It's already doing a good amount of compression, so I don't actually think I'm going to push any more volume into this. In fact, I may pull it back a little bit because I am compressing quite a bit here. Okay, and that was our first instance of Maximus. Now I'm going to do the entire process 2 more times. And this time, as you can see on the bands, I brought them in. So instead of being down by the 50, it's now up by the 175. And then instead of being by the 10K, this has now been brought in around the 5K. Okay, but the process itself will be the exact same. Something else I forgot to mention is in all of my low bands, I'm merging my signal by 10%. And I do that 10% each time I do this. So in the end, I'll have done it 4 times, pushing the lows 10% into the merged signal each time, and then I'm doing the opposite with the highs. I'm pulling them into the separated signal. And the reason I do it in small amounts at a time instead of all at once, you could probably get the same effect by doing it all at once, if I'm being honest. But my idea is like the lower it is, the more in mono it will sound if I do it this way. And so it's almost like there's a gradient of sounds that are in the mono versus like the separated field. It may not make a big difference, so I'm open to ideas for this sort of thing. But let's look at the lows. Okay, I'm going to pull this back by 0.2. Okay, so push this up by 0.2, pull this back by 0.2. Let's go to the mids. So I'm going to pull this back by 0.8. All right, let's go to the highs. And just by looking at this, I can tell that this is probably a clap or a snare or something, and I probably want to grab that sound. Okay, so I pushed this up by 4.2. Let's pull this down by 4.2. Let's go to the master. And again, I don't know that I need to push the volume into this very much at all. If any, I might just leave it the way it is. I think the amount of compression it's doing is fine. Okay, so let's go to the next instance of Maximus. Now this is the third one. And this one's going to be slightly different with how I set the bands. So I'm going to go to the middle. I'm going to hit solo so that we only hear the middle band. And then I'm going to move these so that I no longer hear the kick or the 808, okay? Or at least the majority of that sound goes away. You can go pretty high sometimes depending on how your sounds are. So I'm not really hearing the 808 or the kick too much up here, so I think I'll stop here. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this higher band, except I'm going to pull it back until I don't really hear the hi-hats. And I already kind of don't, so I don't need to pull this too far. Okay, now the process will be basically the same. So let's push into this compressor a little bit. Okay. So I pushed up into it 0.6, so let's pull it back by 0.6. The most prominent thing in the mid should be that main clap or that main snare. And we can see that it is, in fact, the most prominent thing. And the purpose of compressing is, if you'll notice, look at the orange line on the right there. It's kind of hitting at the very top of this guy right here, okay, this snare clap. There's a little bit of a difference between that and right here, which is where the top of this one is. That's the sort of thing that, or you might notice it, and that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to like reduce here, is this little bit of a gap between the main snares, okay? Okay, and you can see the amount of compression that's happening is a little bit less in some cases, which is what I want. Okay, all right, so I pushed this up by 1.9, so let's pull this down by 1.9. Okay, and something else I like to do is, at this stage, is make my main hat or main snare just poke out just a little bit more. So I like to make a dot below, like the dot I'm using for compression, and bring it up pretty far, so that I'm really, like, within this range here, between these two lines, really the only thing that's there is the main clap or the main snare, okay? Now, you might get a little bit of information, like, from a rim or something else, but it shouldn't be that too that big of a deal. And if it is, just move it up and it'll affect those sounds even less so. And then just take this and then arc it up a little bit. If I'd make it extreme like this, you can clearly see what's happening. Okay, it's pulling the volume of just that loudest stuff up by quite a bit. I don't want it to be that extreme though, so let's just bring it down. Okay, let's go to the highs. And again, in this range, I'm okay with compressing a lot here because I don't want my claps and snares to be the most prominent thing in this high register. Okay, and it looks like I can push a little bit into this compressor. Oh, and I think I forgot to mention this. The only time I don't worry about level matching is when I'm on the master, because if you don't level match when you're on one of these bands, what you're doing is you're changing the volume of that like frequency range. So you're changing the balance of the song. If you're pushing the volume up on the master, you're pushing the volume up of everything. So the balance doesn't change. So it doesn't matter if you level match on the master. You're just going to be making it louder or quieter. Okay, let's go to the next thing in the chain. I've got two patcher presets. One is for like stereo separation versus, you know, putting things in mono. I'm just doing this in small amounts because I'm also doing this every time I pull up Maximus. So I don't need to do it too much all at once, again, because I'm doing it in small amounts. So I'm pulling the lows in mono, pushing the higher frequencies out to the sides. You can play with these to taste, but I'm taking the mid-highs and I'm pushing them out to the sides and the low mids and bringing them into the mono space a bit. Okay, next patch of reset is a mid-side EQ. And on the sides, I like to cut the lows and kind of boost kind of the bass range a little bit. Let's see what it looks like. Because I don't like to have too much sub-frequency coming in on the sides. Okay, and on just the mids, so this is the signal just going to the mids, I like to add some saturation on just that loud stuff. And then look at the mids. Kind of cutting the lows and the extreme highs. This EQ is probably redundant because I've done this like 18 times at this point. But again, cutting the lows and cutting the highs. And then I have a wave shaper. And on this one, I have it set as a hard clipper. So this is going to be hard clipping. As soon as the volume gets up to here, it's going to clip it off at the top here. And then sometimes I like to boost and kind of distort the quiet stuff. Let's see what it sounds like just as is. Here we go. Okay, and you can see that's how loud we're getting. So we are doing a little bit of clipping here, but I tend to want to push this a little bit louder, just so that the volume of the whole thing goes up. Now, when you do this, you are going to be hard clipping like the loudest stuff off the top. So just keep that in mind because it may affect the texture of the sound. So, and then because I just did some clipping and I clipped off a little bit of the volume that's on the top, I can now push this up. I usually get about 0.3 decibels out of this. And this doesn't matter too much just because a little bit of extra volume that we can push without actually doing any limiting. Okay, so that's my pre-master chain. So let's save it. So really all I've done here is like a series of compressions, EQ, and then stereo separation. So putting things in mono versus separated. And that's basically it. I also did some hard clipping, but you can get a similar effect with like limiting and compression and that sort of thing, I'm sure. But let's go to the master chain. So this is going to be more or less the same sort of stuff. Okay, so this first EQ is probably redundant, but I'm cutting the lows a little bit. And then you'll see I have two compressors and a limiter. Now I'm open to this second one we'll get to. This first one's more of a normal looking compressor with some normal settings. And on this one, sometimes I have it mixed all the way on, sometimes I don't. Let's have it mixed all the way on just to see what it sounds like. But my default settings for this are kind of having a faster release, a slower attack, and then I have like a 3:1 ratio, and then I'm bringing the threshold down about 10 decibels, pushing up the volume a couple of decibels. And this is what it sounds like before and after. So here's before. Okay, and here's after. Okay, so everything got just a little bit louder, just a little bit more like impactful, I guess. And like I said, sometimes this compressor isn't necessary, and sometimes I want to add it, but I don't want to add it like entirely. And so what I'll do is I'll mix the signal back. And sometimes this will be mixed back as far as, 25, 30%. Sometimes it's all the way on. It really depends. Usually it's sitting somewhere in between halfway and 75, but maybe let's mix it back a little bit. Okay, now let's look at this second compressor. This one's a bit ridiculous. As you can see by the settings on it, I've got kind of the opposite settings for the attack and release. So I've got a 0 attack, very fast attack, and a slow release, and then a 3-to-1 ratio again, but this time my threshold is being brought down by 30 decibels, and then my gain is being pushed up by like just 20. Way over compressing things and then pushing the volume way up. So if I turn this all the way on, and if you're wearing headphones, you might want to turn the volume down, because I'm about to hit play, and you're going to hear what it sounds like when the settings are like this and it's mixed all the way on. So I don't know if you could hear it or not, but like there's like this pumping effect anytime the bass goes in and out. So it's like boom, boom, boom. So it's like this pushing and pull. The point is, I'm compressing this way too much. However, what you can do is over compress the signal and then mix it like almost all the way back, and you'll just kind of add like a little bit of like. So the idea is, in this case, I'm going to add just a little bit more like depth, a little bit more impact to the sound. And you can tell I can mix it all the way back and we can still kind of hear a difference. Just having it like 10% mixed in is enough a lot of the time. I'm also open to, like, sometimes I don't use this compressor at all because it doesn't sound good all the time, because again, you are like way over compressing the sound. So this one, and both of these are really optional, but this one especially is optional. Okay, so in this limiter I'm really only using so that I can monitor everything. So let's look at our last instance of Maximus. Now I'm going to treat this one the same way I treated the third instance of Maximus on the pre-master chain. And by that I mean we're going to take the mid-band, solo it, and then move the bands in so that we don't hear the kick or the hi-hats, or the 808 and hi-hats. Okay, and then the process will be exactly the same. Now, I mentioned this earlier, I don't know if I cut it out of the video or not, but at this stage, instead of compressing a little bit, or compressing a little bit more, or compressing a little bit more, which is what we did in the pre-master chain, this time I'm limiting. So I'm bringing this all the way down so that it is flat. Okay, so we pushed this up by 0.5, so I pulled it back by 0.5. Let's go to the mids. Okay, we pushed this up by 0.9, so I'm pulling this back by 0.9. And we have another EQ. This one, again, this one's probably redundant, but again, it's the same thing. It's just pushing the low frequencies into the mono and then doing the opposite for the high frequencies. So putting those in the separated space. And then again, you can kind of mess with the middle bands to taste. So I have a limiter and then a soft clipper. So I'm going to use the limiter kind of just as a gauge, and then I'll kind of use that as a gauge for how much I want to push the volume up into this soft clipper that's coming out. So visually, looks like I could probably push the volume about there before I really start destroying the sound. I don't know that for sure. It's just, this will just be my starting point. But what I'm really looking for is, if you look at this green line, I'm looking for like how far I think the volume could be like squashed up into something before you would notice it. And what I'm kind of looking for are like the loudest parts, which is the majority of these points up here, but then like the next loudest points. So if you look at like the next loudest sections, you'll see this little guy right here. That's a little bit lower down than the loudest stuff. Same thing right here. That guy's a little bit lower down. Same thing right here. There's a little bit of information that's lower. Here, there's some information that's lower. Same thing here. This guy's a little bit lower here. So I'm really looking for like the next loudest things. Here's another one right here where it's a little bit lower. And I'm trying to see like, and I use that as like a gauge, like a visual gauge for how much I think I can push the volume before it distorts the sound. Now, it's not like an exact science. You could probably push more or push less in almost every situation. It just gives me like a baseline for how much like I'm going to start do that. So okay. I brought it down by 1.2. And I think that's about as far as I want to take it to begin with. Let's put this after the soft clipper. And then I'm going to push 1.2 decibels into this soft clipper. Okay, so I'm going to come up here, push 1.2. Okay, so what's happening is I push the volume 1.2 decibels, then it goes into the soft clipper, and then it's coming into this limiter, which is what we're seeing. Okay, and visually, it looks like I did a pretty decent job of bringing the volumes of all the loudest stuff up like together. But you can obviously still see some little pockets of information or little bits of information that is a little bit quieter. So like if I brought this down to about here, we can see there's a little bit of information here that's a little bit quieter. There's a little bit here. This stuff is a little bit on the louder side. There's this one right here as well, and this one. So I could probably get away with pushing this volume up just a little bit more. Okay. So you can see I'm going to push an additional 0.9 decibels into the software. Okay, so if I'm pushing 0.9, this is 1.2 plus 0.9 is 2.1. So we're going to go up to 2.1. Okay, and that's basically the entire process. Now, there may be an exception to that, but generally speaking, I'm trying to push the volume up to the -8s, -9s, maybe even -7, depending on the track, but that's usually a little bit louder than I want it. But down here, this never got above -0.2, so I think I'm happy with that. I don't think I'm going to change anything because I never got above 0 here. So I guess technically I could push a little bit of extra volume so that I go up to 0, but then I could be risking getting just ever so slightly too loud. I think I'm fine with the loudness that I'm at. So I'm going to disconnect this. And again, if you have information on how to use this tool better, or if I'm using it incorrectly in some kind of way, feel free to let me know down in the comments. All right, so that's basically the video. I guess I'll just let part of this run, and then that'll be it. If you have any questions, feel free to throw them down in the comments.